Hi, this is Caleb Ward with Shutterstock.com, and in this exciting After Effects tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create an epic fighter jet attack sequence. In order to build this scene in a more manageable way, we're going to think about it as a collection of 5 different parts: a camera tracker, laser beams, building glares, explosions, and a jet. Alright, so let's jump in. So the first thing we're going to do is go to File, New, Project, and we're going to import our assets. So in your downloads folder that you get from going to the corresponding blog post on shutterstock.com/blog, you'll see these 4 different video assets along with a .psd file. Just select all 4 of those and click open. So the first thing we're going to do is drag our aerial of Philadelphia down to this new composition button here and let go. So if we scrub through, we can see that this is about a 15-second long video sequence that really is too long for our scene. We really want just about the first 5 seconds. So what we can do here is drag our endpoint to about 5 seconds and right click in this little gray area here and hit Trim Comp to Work Area. So now we have a 5-second composition where we can see this street where the main part of our tutorial will be taking place, and it kind of dips down at the very end. So before we begin building our scene, we actually want to put in a 3D camera tracking effect that will basically track all of the movement in our scene and make it more easy for us to drop in our 3D elements. So to do that, I'm going to go to 3D Camera Tracker, and I'm going to drag it onto our footage layer here. And so you'll see this analyzing in the background text pop up. This may take a while depending on how much RAM your computer has and how good your video processor is, but it shouldn't take more than just a few minutes, and so we'll let this load and then we'll move on. Alright, so the 3D camera tracker has finished analyzing our scene, and you'll see that there's little colored tracker points all throughout our composition here. So if we scrub through, we can see these track points move throughout our scene and follow our footage. Now, this is a really easy way to track your scene without using tracking softwares like Mocha or using the point tracker, which was included in old versions of After Effects. And I guess technically it's still in After Effects, but it's just a far less helpful tool to use. So to create a camera for our composition, I'm just going to click on the Create Camera icon here, and we can see here that we have a 3D camera that's now in our scene, and you don't see anything happen right away because we don't have any 3D elements in our scene, but as soon as we include them in there, they'll actually be tracked into our scene. So the next thing that we want to do is create the laser beams that are going to be coming from the jet before it actually flies into our scene. So to do that, I'm going to go to Composition, New Composition, and it can be 6 seconds long, that's fine. And we want our width to be 3000 pixels, and our height, we only want it to be 50 pixels. 24 frames per second, and we can call this beam and hit OK. So in order to make the beam, what I'm going to do is go to Layer, New, Solid, and we can just call this beam, and it doesn't matter the color, so we can keep it black and hit OK. And I'm going to type in beam and drag in the beam effect. And so this creates just kind of like a lightsaber-like beam effect. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to time here and move it all the way to 0. And what we're going to do is drag our starting point here and hold down Shift and drag it just off the end of the composition here. And for the other end, we don't want it to go all the way past the composition because this is going to be where the beam impacts the ground. It can be maybe, I don't know, 30 pixels away from the edge. And what we're going to do is set a keyframe for the time at 0%, And then we're going to scrub forward about 6 frames, and we'll have the time go to 100%. So now if we scrub through, we can see that there's a real quick beam that just kind of flies to the end here. And what we want is, I like the beam skinny like this for the time in which it's flying through the air, but whenever it hits the ground, we actually want it to be a little bit bigger, like the beam is somehow compressing itself together before it hits the ground, just to push in the impact just a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is put a keyframe at frame number 4 for the starting thickness and ending thickness, and it's at 8 right now, and that's perfectly fine. And we'll move over to keyframe number 5, and we can just change the thickness maybe to 12, and the ending thickness we can change to 12 as well. So now we can see that it's just a little bit thicker, so when you scrub through, it just gets kind of thicker there at the end and then goes into nothingness. So you can see there's a little red dot here at the very, very end, and in order to get rid of this, I'm just going to hit Command-Shift-D, which will create 2 separate layers here, and I will delete the second one. And so now we can see we have our laser, gets big, and then it goes away. So that's exactly what we want for our composition. And the next thing that we want to do is add in some motion blur. So right now the beam it's kind of has some hard edges. So if we type in CC Force Motion Blur, we can drag that to our beam layer here, and maybe we can change the shutter angle to about 100. And the motion blur samples at 8 is perfectly fine. So this will just kind of smooth out the edges and make it look like it's kind of blurring through the sky a little bit more. And before we get going any further, I'm just going to go ahead and change the color of our beam from kind of a pinkish red to maybe a little bit more of a blue and a cyan color. Yeah, something like that. And so the next thing we want to do is actually create a vapor trail behind our beam. So perhaps the beam is going so fast that it's breaking the sound barrier. So to do that, I'm going to duplicate the beam here, and we can drag the end to about 1 second. So it's about 24 frames long. And for the second beam layer, I'll go ahead and name it, we call it vapor layer. And the length can actually be 100% for this one. And the time will deselect the stopwatch here, and we'll just do 50. So the color is blue, and we don't really want that for our vapor layer. We actually want to do completely white for both the inside color and the outside color. And the thickness, we'll just keep it at a consistent 8 throughout. And for the opacity, we actually want to drop it down. If we just select our vapor layer here and hit T, we can change it to 10. So now if you look closer, you can see there's a vapor layer behind our beam, but the problem is the vapor shouldn't appear before the beam. So what we're going to do is add in a mask effect. So if we just hit this rectangle tool here, we can scrub to the very beginning and kind of create a shape here. And we'll just go in frame by frame for a little bit here, and I'm going to select the keyframe for mask path, and we'll move over to frame number 1, and with our selection tool we can kind of drag it along with the beam here and go to frame number 2, do the same thing, 3, 4, 5, and then 6, we can move to the very end. All right, so now what we want to do is set a keyframe for our opacity. So as soon as the beam hits the ground, we want the vapor trail to slowly disappear. So it'll disappear over the course of 1 second. So we'll just set a keyframe at 6 frames, and then at 1 second, we'll set a keyframe for 0. So now we can see, we kind of zoom in here, we have our beam shoots across and the smoke trail slowly fades away. All right, so now it's time to actually put our beam into the composition. So we're going to go to our aerial composition here, and I'm going to select our footage layer, and select the 3D camera tracker. So as you can see, we have these little targets that if we drag our mouse over some of these little track points, it'll pop up here. And I'm going to select this area right here next to the building because I actually want the beams to be going down the street here, but the closest thing we have to the street, because there's no track points in the sky here, is this building. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to do create null. All right, so in order to see this null a little bit better, I'm just going to scale it up so we can see that it is completely tracked with our building here. So that's a pretty decent track, and especially for our beams, since they're only going to be on for a few seconds, it doesn't have to be perfect, but this is looking really good. So one interesting thing that you can do is if we go to our beam composition here, with our track null selected in the timeline, we can hold down Option and drag it over the track null, and it will replace the null with the beam. So what this did is it made it to where we don't have to drop the beam perfectly into the composition. And you may see that, oh, we can't see the beam, but that's only because we replaced it with a null object, which has an opacity of 0. So if we just select our beam here and hit T, we can drag up the opacity. So now we see we have our beam layer. So what we're going to do is scale down the beam significantly. So maybe we want to do about, let's say, 150. So now we can see that we have our beam, but the orientation's not right. So if you hit W or just select the rotation tool here, we can start moving it around our scene to where the beam is going in the right direction. So I'm going to select the Y here, kind of move it to where it looks like it's facing down the street, and we can adjust it along the x-axis here. So now if we look through, we have the beam, but you can see the beam is going backwards. So what we're going to do is flip it exactly 180 degrees around. So we can just spin this here, right about there. And what we're going to do is hit the V button or select the selection tool up here. And we're going to move this beam to where it's over the street area here. And so now we can see that the beam shoots down the street, and it's looking pretty good. But the problem is the beam starts in the middle of the street and it ends in the middle of the street. So we don't want that. So in order to fix that, we're going to move the beam, and we're going to make sure we have our X selected here. We're going to move it back in space to maybe right about there. And one thing is, your jet is going to be at a higher altitude than where the beam strikes the ground. So we actually want our beam to be tilted down just a little bit. So maybe down to right about there. So now we can see that the laser hits the ground, and it's hitting the ground right about where this car is. And maybe we want it to go to a little bit to the left of this car here. And instead of it just immediately starting out with the beam, I think I want it to start out at about maybe 1.5 seconds. So maybe right about here is where the beams start going. So I'm just going to drag our beam layer here to about 1:15. And so now if we scrub through, we can see that our beam kind of shoots down, and perhaps we want to get the angle just right. So I'm going to adjust the rotation again and adjust the position. So now we see that the beam kind of strikes the ground right about here, and that's fine. So in order to create 4 different beams, all we have to do now is duplicate it 3 more times. So now we have 4 beams, and right now it's a little weird because they're all stacked up on top of each other, but let's go ahead and offset these by about 4 frames each. So I'm just going to skip ahead 4 frames, drag all 3. Now we're going to select the top 2, and we're going to move ahead 4 more frames and drag them over, and then 4 more frames and select the top one and drag it over. So now we see we have 4 different beams shooting across, but we don't want them to hit the exact same point. We actually want them to strike progressively further points along our scene here. So I'm going to select this beam here, and we can scale it up. So if we hit the S key with the beam selected, we can stretch it out a little bit further, and we can move the position over a little. and rotate it just a little bit more to where it's impacting the ground right about here. So we can do the exact same thing for the third beam. So if you select the third beam here, we can kind of scrub through to the point where it impacts the ground. We can scale it up just a little bit more, and we'll go ahead and hit the W key to rotate it. And we want it to shoot down the street here. And with our selection tool here, we're gonna move it and rotate it to where it's impacting the ground just a little bit further down the street. We can do the exact same thing for our very last beam. Now the very last beam, we're gonna want it to hit this white car here. So to do that, I'm going to turn up the scaling once again, and we can turn this one up to maybe about 250 or so. And we'll adjust the rotation one more time to where it ends right where the car is, and we can adjust the position. We hit V and W, so it's just kind of a balancing act. You want to just get it just right. So now if we kind of scrub through our composition here, we see we have 4 different shots, and we can adjust these as we need them. So the second beam here, you can kind of see that maybe it's kind of going into the wall a little bit. We don't want that. So I can just hit the W key for the rotation tool and put it a little bit more down the street, right about there. And if we drag through here, we can see we have 4 different beams, and they all strike different points along the street. Cool. And this is looking cool because you can see the vapor trails follow the beams all the way down. So before we get going any further, one cool thing that I think we could do is make the vapor trails a little bit more non-linear. So we want it to look like maybe the bullet was kind of swerving through the sky before it actually impacted the ground. So to do that, I'm going to type in Turbulent Displace, and we can apply it to our first beam here. And I'm just going to hit Shift Command H so that we can better see our elements here. And you can see that the beam is moving way too much. It looks really silly. So we're going to turn down the amount to maybe something very slight. So maybe about 7 or so. And I'm going to copy the Turbulent Displace, and we'll just apply this to all of our other beams. And so now you can see that it's a little less perfect, but it looks a lot better for our scene here. Awesome. So the last thing we want to do with our beams before we move on is apply a glow effect. So I'm going to type in glow and drag it over to our first beam here. And so the glow is a little too intense, so I'm going to turn up the radius. And instead of original colors, I'll do AB colors, and we want it to glow blue. So let's just select a couple blue colors here. And we can turn up the threshold as we need it to maybe right before it starts glowing the vapor trail. And we can turn up the radius and perhaps the intensity just a little bit. Cool. Right about there is good. And so I'm going to copy the glow effect and apply it to all 3 of our other beams. So now if we scrub through, we can see all 3 of our beams, or all 4 of our beams rather, have some glow to them. All right, so this is looking great. And the next thing we want to do is create a few layers that can simulate the glares from these beams flying through. So to do that, I'm going to hit Command Y, and I'm going to call this Glare 1, and we'll select kind of a color that's about the same color as our beam, about a blue there, and we'll change the transfer mode to overlay. And I'm going to turn down the opacity. And so what we want to do is by hand go in frame by frame with our beams as they travel across the sky and simulate the glare that the beam would have on the building as it flies by. So to do that, I'm going to just move this glare layer over our first beam, and I'm going to select our pen tool here, and I'm going to cut out an area along this building here where the glare flies by. And maybe we can turn the opacity up so we can see it a little bit better. And I'm going to hit M and put a keyframe on the mask path. So this is frame number 1, and I'm going to go ahead and trim the layer here the glare layer so that it's only popping up when the beam is on the screen. And I'm going to hit F to feather it out. And we can adjust the mask here to where it's perfectly on this building here as it flies by. And I'm going to move ahead 1 frame. And we can adjust the mask as we need it. So, you know, the beam's kind of moving forward, so the glare would kind of change. We can move ahead 1 more frame, and the glare would maybe move a little bit further down. Move ahead 1 more frame. Move it ahead just a little bit more, and move ahead 1 more frame. As it moves across the sky here. And then it impacts the ground. And I'm going to trim the end off here. So now you can see that as this first beam goes by, the building kind of has a glare to it, just to make it blend a little bit more with our scene. So we want to do the same thing for all 3 of our other beams. So what I'm going to do is duplicate the glare layer here and move it over on top of beam number 2. And I'll just go in a little bit faster for this one and adjust it as we need it. And move forward. We're just following this beam as it flies through the city here. Just trying to add in any extra building glares that we may need. And I'm going to duplicate this again, put it on top. And we can see our 3rd beam starts out here. So it's going to glare against the background here and impact the ground down here. Cool. And the very last glare here, we'll duplicate it 1 more time and drag it over. So we can see our final beam is probably the biggest. Just adjust it as we need it. And there's really no fast shortcut for this. Unfortunately, if you want it done right, you just need to spend a little bit extra time trying to get all the glares perfectly fine. And I mean, we could go in and try to simulate shadows and get really detailed with this, but this is about the fastest way that we can still make it look good. And then move the mask down here. It's going to probably glare against these buildings here. And adjust it to where it's on the car there. And in fact, we maybe want to spread this out to where the last one's maybe a little bit brighter than all the other ones. Cool. So now if we scrub through, we can see that we have all these beams flying through and they make glares against the buildings, and it just kind of adds to the realism. So the next thing we want to do is create the impact points on the ground where the beams are hitting, and this will just emphasize how powerful they are. So to do that, I'm going to hit Command N, and we can do 1000 by 1000, and we'll call this explosion point, and we'll only want this to be about 1 second long, and hit OK. So what we're going to do is actually use a shape layer to simulate the impact point. So I'm going to go to Layer, New, Shape Layer, and we're going to add a new ellipse, and that's about the right size, and we're going to add in a fill, and instead of red, we want it to be that same blue color that we've been using for the majority of this tutorial. And we want it to basically be a small, very compressed impact point in the beginning, and then we want it to dissipate over time. So what we're going to do is we'll set a keyframe at 0 frames, and we can just move forward maybe about 5 frames and scale this up. And what we'll do is we'll set an opacity keyframe. So I hit T, and I'm going to hit the stopwatch here at 0 and move ahead to frame number 5 and move this down to 0. So now we see we have this hard point that's fully opaque, and then it disappears. So what we'll do is add in a fast blur effect to this shape, and we can feather it out. So now we can see it's a hard point and it kind of fades out. Cool, so this is looking good. What I'm gonna do is duplicate the shape layer, and I'm gonna stretch this opacity keyframe out at the very end here. And if you hit UU, it'll pop up all the keyframes that you've changed for a specific layer. So you can see that this one kind of scales up over time, over the course of about 5 frames, but we actually wanted to scale up over maybe 20 frames. So I'm just going to drag that to the end there. And so we have this second layer here that scales up slower. And I'm just going to add in a fractal noise effect. And I'm going to scale this up just a little bit, maybe right about there, just to make it look like there's a little more debris. And maybe instead of 100% opacity, maybe we want it to be about 50% opacity in the beginning. And so it just kind of fades up over time. And maybe we want the scale to be a little bit bigger. So maybe the scale's about the same size as the end of our blue impact spot here. So we can just scale it up to right about there. And we'll move the opacity here, the 50%, to the end, and I'll change this to 0. So if we solo this here, we see we have an impact point that kind of grows and then it fades out. So now it's time to add these impact points into our actual composition. So to do that, I'm just going to go back into our main comp here, and we'll take a look at each spot where the beams hit the ground. So for our first beam, it hits the ground right about here. So instead of using a 3D camera tracker and all that, for this element, it would just be easier if we just dropped it in and applied just a few keyframes. So I'm just going to drag in our explosion point to the exact point where the beam hits the ground here, and we'll go ahead and scale it down. We can kind of rotate it just a little bit and kind of stretch it. And basically all we're doing is simulating 3D. This isn't actual 3D, but it's fine for this layer because it's so crude and small in our scene that the audience will never notice. And so if we hit P here, we'll set a position keyframe. And if we scrub forward just a little bit, we can follow where this beam ends up here, and we'll scale it down even a little bit more. And let's change our blending mode to hard light. So that's just going to make it blend in a little bit more. So now we can see that there's kind of this hard impact point where the beam hits. Looks pretty good. And let's turn the opacity down maybe about 50%, 51%, that's fine. So there we go. There's that cool impact point that just kind of looks like dust fading away. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this explosion point, and we'll put it over our second glare here. We'll move it down. And so we see our second beam impacts right about here. So I'm going to hit U to look at our position keyframes. So we want our position to be here, and then we want it to move right about here. So now we can see it impacts and kind of sticks with the beam location. And you may notice that it's kind of bleeding over this building here. We'll fix that here in a little bit, so don't worry about it. And we'll duplicate this explosion point one more time and put it over the third beam. And so the third beam, we can see it impacts the ground right about here. So I'm going to adjust the position of our explosion point to where it's over that point here. And then we'll move to the final keyframe and we'll kind of keep it over that point. So if we scrub through here, we can see that it's an explosion in the ground again. It's looking good. And then let's duplicate the last explosion point, drag it to the top. And the last one's easy because it explodes on the car. So we can basically hit U, look at the position and adjust it over the car, scrub to the second keyframe and adjust it over the car again. So now if we scrub out here, we can kind of see that we have these impact points on the ground and they just emphasize the power of each one of these beams. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is actually add in our explosion, our fire elements into the scene. So to do that, we're going to select our aerial footage and go to our 3D camera tracker. And you can see that we have these 3 points right here next to the car that we want to blow up. So if we right click and do create solid, we'll create this cyan solid here. And what we can do is we can drag in our fiery flames layer or footage element here. And so if you select it and hold down Option, it will replace the tracked solid here. And what we want to do is make it go faster. So the footage is actually in slow-mo, which is cool, but it's not necessarily useful for our real-time effect. So to do that, I'm going to right-click and go to Time Stretch, and we'll change the stretch factor to 15%. So it's going to go about 6 times faster than the normal speed. And if we drag out the endpoint here, we can see that basically we can get our footage to where it starts exactly at the point of impact. So maybe right about here, we can drag our footage here and the fire kind of grows. So obviously the rotation's off. So we'll hit W and we want to rotate this where it matches our scene perfectly. And we also want to scale it down, kind of move it to where it's over the car here. And let's change the transfer mode to add. Okay, cool. So you can see that there's this fire on the car here, and it's at the point of impact where the beam happens. And so we can just move the position to where it matches exactly where we want it to. And you'll notice that there's a hard edge on the bottom here. To fix that, I'm going to select our pen tool, and we can kind of create this little V shape here. And we'll just hit F to feather it out. So now, if we scrub through, we can see that the fire is on the car and it kind of stays there. And it's pretty bright compared to the rest of our scene here. So to fix that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in tritone and apply it to our fiery flame layer. And we'll just change the blend with original to maybe about 70%. And that's just going to cut out on a little bit of the saturation of the fire. So this is looking great. And what I want to do now is add in a little bit more of a fire element. So just like before, we're going to create a new solid. So I'm going to select our tracked aerial footage here, and we'll select our track point here and create a new solid. And I'm going to select our fire burning at night and hold down Option and replace the track solid in the timeline. And so just like before, what I'm going to do is adjust the rotation using the rotation tool, and we just want this fire to be oriented in the right direction, and we can kind of move it around, change the blending mode to add, and scale it down to where it matches our scene here. And let's go ahead and cut out the bottom just like we did before with the other fire layer. So we can kind of cut it out and feather out the edges just a little bit. And let me apply the tritone effect so we can just copy it from the other fire layer and apply it to the new fire layer just to cut out on some of the unnecessary saturation. And let's make sure that it doesn't burn the whole time, because that would make no sense, but maybe we want it the initial explosion to go off, and then we want this secondary fire to slowly fade in. So I'm going to hit T, and we'll move forward a little bit and turn the opacity off completely. So now we have this kind of big mushroom cloud, and then the fire kind of starts burning on top of the car, and it just makes it look like it's an epic destruction scene. And what we can do is, to make it look a little more believable, I'm going to duplicate the burning fire layer, and I'm going to actually scale it up. So what this is going to do is create fire that's all around the scene, and obviously we don't want that. But if we add in a fast blur effect to the top layer here and blur it out just a little bit more, and turn down the opacity even more, so maybe we want the opacity to be somewhere at like 20%, we can see that it creates this kind of glowing effect at the end of the street. So the explosion happens and there's this glow. And so maybe we want the explosion brightness to start right about here where the initial mushroom cloud starts coming up. So I'm going to move our opacity keyframe to right here and move forward a little bit and turn it to 0. So now we have an explosion that hits, and then it kind of glows a little bit more, and we can stretch this out to where it's appropriate for our scene, and it kind of follows the composition. Okay, cool. So now we have our beam, we have our explosion, we have our ground elements. The next thing that we want to do is add in our jet. So to add in our jet, what we're going to do is go to our project panel, and I'm just going to drop our jet into a new composition. So by default, it's only 1 second long. So I'm going to go to composition, composition settings, and change the duration to maybe about 6 seconds, just like our final composition. And we'll just go ahead and drag it over here. So the first thing we want to do is, since it's a bright blue, I actually kind of want it to be maybe a little bit more of a desert tan. So I'm going to apply the tritone effect again, and we'll adjust it just a little bit to maybe about there. And the glowing fire behind the jet isn't exactly what I want it to be. I actually want it to be a little bit more blue or cyan. So to do that, I'm going to just duplicate the jet layer here, and I'll delete the tritone, and let's select the ellipse tool and just select the fire here in the very back. So now if we solo this layer, it's just the rear exhaust here from the jet. Now what we want to do is change the red fire to blue fire. So to do that, we can just use the hue and saturation effect. And if we drag that over here and adjust the wheel, we can move it till we get blue. And let's apply a glow effect. So when we apply the glow effect, it'll create this kind of glowing blue core here, which is exactly what we want. And what we'll do is hold down Option and select the stopwatch next to intensity. And we'll do a quick expression. We'll say wiggle, open parentheses. We'll say 5 times a second for an intensity parameter of 2, and close parentheses, semicolon. So now if we kind of scrub through here, we can see that the rear of the jet kind of glows, and it makes it look like there's just like a fire end coming off. And right now it's getting its glow colors from the original colors. We actually want to do a B, and just like before, we'll select a cyan, and another cyan color. So now if we kind of scrub through, we see that there's like this glowing blue coming out the back of the plane here. Okay, cool. So before we drop our jet into our scene, one thing I want to do is drop the color of the jet just a little bit more because it's kind of bright. So I'm just going to kind of bring this down here a little bit. And we'll go to our aerial composition. And just like what we've done with all of our other elements, we actually want to select our aerial camera tracker from the very beginning of the tutorial. And we'll select a point right on this wall here, and we'll do right click, create solid. And with our jet composition selected, we'll drag it down here and hold down option to replace. So now we have our jet here and it's tracked into our scene, but it looks really silly whenever it's just sitting there. So we actually want it to fly through the street here. So to do that, I'm going to just pick a point where I want the jet to enter the frame. So maybe we want it to enter right about here. And I'm going to hit P for position. So I'm going to hit the stopwatch and we'll move the jet off screen in Z space. And then we'll move forward maybe, I don't know, about a second, maybe a second and a half. And we'll move the jet completely through the scene down the street. So we can see that our jet kind of flies through the scene. And maybe we want to push it even further so that it looks a little bit more believable here. So the jet just flies through the scene. And let's go ahead and scale it down. It's kind of big. So we can scale it down right about here. And we can even turn on the motion blur to make it look a little more believable. Cool. So that's looking pretty good. I think what I want to do though is as the jet gets into the shadow of this building here, it should get darker. So to do that, I'm going to apply a curves effect to our jet. And we'll set a keyframe right here for the frame right before it gets in front of the building. And then we'll move forward one frame, and let's say the jet's now in the shadows. So we can kind of drag down the little curved line here, and it'll just make it darker. So it makes it look just a little bit more believable for our scene. And the next thing we want to do is add in a shadow. So the jet is a physical object, so it should be creating a shadow against anything like this, the top of this building here or these buildings over here, so to make it look a little bit more believable like it's actually in this scene. So to do that, you can just duplicate the jet layer here. And I'm going to adjust the anchor point. So if you just hit the arrow here and go to anchor point, you can move this second jet over to where it's over this building here, and we can drop down the Y. So it may look a little silly, but this jet's just going to follow the main jet. And what we want to do is apply a fill effect to the shadow jet layer, and I'll go ahead and name this layer here. We'll call it shadow jet layer, and we'll make it black, and we don't need it to have a curves effect. And I'll apply just a quick fast blur effect. We can kind of turn it up just a little bit. So now you can see that there's this shadow layer that kind of follows the jet as it flies through the scene. And you'll notice maybe right about here, the shadow's kind of bleeding off the edge here. So to fix that, we can just simply move this shadow jet layer over just a little bit with the anchor point here. Yep, perfect, just like that. And maybe we want to turn down the opacity just a little bit. And we'll cut it off right after the jet goes past, the jet shadow goes past the end of the building here. So now we can see we have the jet, it flies by, the shadow follows, and then the shadow goes away as soon as the jet seemingly goes past the area where the shadow should be. And so what we want to do is add in a similar shadow over here. So you can see the shadow of this building stops about here and picks up right about here. So the jet shadow should hypothetically jump from right here to over here as soon as the shadow hops off the top of the building. So to do that, I'm just going to duplicate this jet shadow layer, and we can basically move it to where it picks up right where this shadow layer goes away. And I will hit A for the anchor point, and we can just move the shadow to where it kind of starts at the top of where we can move the anchor point to where it starts at where the shadow from the building lets off. So now when we watch it back, we can see that the shadow follows the jet, and then it pops up over there. And maybe we want this second shadow over here to be less opaque, so maybe we want to drop it down to maybe about 25%. So now we can see both shadows kind of follow the jet as it flies through. So this is looking great, and the very last thing that I want to do is create a tail for our jet here. So to do that, I'm going to select our aerial layer here and select the 3D tracker, and we'll select a point on the building here and right click create solid. And so the fun thing that we can do with this solid though is we can actually convert a solid into an adjustment layer. And so the adjustment layer will basically affect all the other layers beneath it. So if we look at our jet here, we can see that it flies through our scene, but we want this vapor trail to come out the end. So to do that, I'm just gonna rotate and scale up this solid here to where it follows exactly behind the jet layer. So if we kind of scale it up, we can see that the jet kind of falls out over there. So we can kind of move this up and perhaps stretch it out. And maybe we even need to rotate it just a little bit. Oop. Maybe we need to rotate it just a little bit to follow the jet as it goes through the scene here. So it's going to take a little bit of trial and error, so we can just keep adjusting things as we need to until it's exactly right. Okay, cool. So to convert this solid into an adjustment layer, you just hit this black and white icon here. And what we'll want to do is apply a Turbulent Displace effect. What this is going to do is it's going to change the way that this layer interacts with the background. So we can turn down the amount here, and you can see that it kind of starts to warp the back here. And that's exactly what we want it to do. And maybe we want to turn down the size too, just a little bit, just to make it look like it's warping just a little bit. And so as the jet flies through the scene, you can see that there's like this slight warping that's going on. And we can even turn up the complexity just a little bit more. And we can turn up the amount just a little bit more. There we go. So now there's this warped trail that follows the jet. And what I want to do is set keyframes so that the jet trail follows the jet throughout the scene. So to do that, I'm going to use our rectangle tool here and kind of adjust it to where it's off the frame here. And we'll set a keyframe for the path, and the jet moves throughout the scene, and we want the path to follow the jet, so we'll kind of follow it out here. And we're going to want to just scrub through here to make sure that it's following the jet and not going in front of it, but it actually looks like it's pretty good. Maybe right about here it needs to kind of pulled back just a little bit, just the mask here. Just adjust it there. So now it follows the jet out. And what we want to do is maybe apply a quick curves effect to the jet to bring up the brightness from behind it. So now the vapor trail is a little bit more visible. And so we can see that if we scrub through our composition here, we have the lasers, we have the explosion, the jet flies through and has a really cool vapor trail. And I'm going to go ahead and actually, let me rename this to vapor trail. And I'm going to move the vapor trail below the jet. Okay, cool. So that's looking great. And the very last thing we want to do is we want to make it to where these beams are not going in front of this building here. So to do that, I'm just going to duplicate our background layer here, and we'll move it right above our beams and our explosion points. And I'm going to just quickly create a mask to mask out this building. And I'll hit the M tool and select the mask path, and we'll just go in by hand really quickly and adjust it to where it's only covering the edge of the building here. So now it kind of follows it as it moves throughout the scene here. So we're just cutting out the building, trying to make it look just a little bit more believable and like these beams are going through the street and not over the building. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do is just Command-Shift-D and delete all the areas of this mask that are unnecessary for our composition here. And I'll do the same thing over here, hit Command-Shift-D and delete it. And we can just continue to get this exactly right. So let's go ahead and take a look at our final result. Okay, cool. So this is looking great. The beams look really good. The fire elements come in at the right time, and the jet looks like it's zipping through the air really quickly, and the vapor trail looks really cool. So for more information about this tutorial, including links to the downloads for the free assets and project files, check out the blog post over at shutterstock.com/blog. And of course, if you're ever looking for the world's best stock footage, images, or music, check out our library at shutterstock.com. Thank you.